Welcome. I'm Sebastian Mahfood, and you're listening to WCAT Radio, the on-air wing of En Route Books and Media, bringing you the dulcet sounds of Catholic wisdom.
All right, well, welcome back, everyone, to yet another episode of the Examine Life with Phil. It's pretty cool that this is still going on. I was kind of worried I might start running out of ideas, but it actually seems like I have more ideas than episodes at the moment. So this week I'm going to cover a very controversial topic. I'm going to try and talk about what we should actually do to help the poor, the disenfranchised, and the downtrodden. And this is especially relevant to Christians because we have not just a standard moral obligation to help those people out, but there's specific requirements that come to us from Scripture. You can just read the words of Christ and other authors of the Bible and see that. So I'm going to try and cover, well, how do we go about doing this? And I'm sure some people will get a little upset because I'll go after a couple of their sacred cows, but that's, the way these things go. When you think through things logically, people get upset sometimes. But before I do that, I'm going to go back to doing my facepalm and sigh award of the week because, it's been quite a while since I've given one of those out with all the interviews I was doing, and then I wasn't following the news as closely, so I didn't see as many people giving as many stupid arguments. But there's a particularly hilarious one from this last week or two that I feel like I need to give an award out for. So a little bit of context here. Earlier this week, I think it was on Tuesday, CNN legal analyst Arvia Martin, and I might be mispronouncing her first name, she was a guest on a radio show hosted by David Webb, who also hosts he hosts a show on Fox Nation, I guess that's a Fox News show, and is also a Sirius XM radio host. And they were debating what merits enable you to qualify for a job or get a job or something like that. And I'll just go ahead and play you the short clip of what happened, because it's actually kind of funny and you need to hear it for yourself.
Shouldn't their primary requirement, regardless of ethnicity, regardless of network, be that they are capable of covering politics? For instance, if you're going to cover political campaigns, sports may not be the most qualified background, and that brings to the point of if people want to get into these fields, regardless of color, I've chosen to cross different parts of the media world, done the work so that I'm qualified to be in each one. I never considered my color the issue. I considered my qualifications the issue.
Well, David, that's a whole nother long conversation about white privilege and things that you have the privilege of doing that people of color don't have the priviless of.
How do I have the privilege of white privilege?
David, by virtue of being a white male, you have white privilege. This whole long conversation, I don't have time to get into it.
Ariva, I hate to break it to you, but you should have been better prepped. I'm black.
Okay.
Now, obviously, that's the kind of thing that would probably only happen on a radio show. That wouldn't happen in a TV show for obvious reasons. Now, after that, Webb went on to tell her that what she was insinuating was very insulting, that she would just assume things of him like that. Martin actually said that she does apologize and blamed her people on giving her the wrong information. She tried to apologize, I think, 2 or 3 times. And Webb continued on saying that he actually has a very diverse background with white, black, Indian, Arawak, Irish, Scottish, and so on. And he said, quote, "And this is part of the problem with driving the narrative and a construct like white privilege. Privilege is one thing where applied well, the economy, various social factors, but not necessarily determined by color of skin." And the issue here isn't so much in my mind that Martin was so obviously wrong, because that doesn't make a bad argument. When you construct an argument and one of the premises is wrong, that doesn't mean you gave a bad argument. It means you were misinformed. So in this case, we might have phrased her argument something like, 1, you only say that because you have white privilege. 2, you're white. 3, therefore you have white privilege. And obviously one of those premises is wrong in that case. And so that's not a bad argument, it's just an incorrect one. The reason this gets my facepalm and sigh award of the week is because, generally speaking, almost all arguments about white privilege are really just pathetic and stupid, and this is an illustration of that. they were debating whether certain merits, i.e. what you've done, the experience you have, the education you have, whether that qualifies you to get a job. That was the position Webb was taking, and you can just hear that in the audio clip. And rather than come back against him and say, well, I think there's more things involved or something like that, Martin just decided, I don't like that, I'm going to accuse him of white privilege. In a sense, she tries to use that as a conversation stopper. I first heard the term of a conversation stopper from the philosopher Richard Rorty, and he was talking about something completely different there. In fact, in episode 3, I referenced that when I was talking about 6 points of persuasion, because I talked about Rorty a little bit there. His point was that there are some premises that you might have that other people don't have access to, so that's a conversation stopper. You can't argue with it. You can't debate it. I think a fair example of that would be that if you have a religious experience where God reveals something to you, well, that's a very strong premise. It's a very strong form of belief that you should take seriously. But other people don't have access to that. They didn't have the same religious experience, so it shouldn't hold the same weight on them. So if you're talking to somebody and you say, I'm a Christian because I had this religious experience, well, that's very good and valid, but it's a conversation stopper for other people in this sense because they didn't have that same religious experience, so they don't get that same appeal that you do. And that's a fair example of it. Rorty actually had some unfair examples of it where he thought that all religious arguments should just be left at home, and if you want to hear me talk about that, go back and listen to episode 3. Well, anyhow, that's how these, what Webb termed constructs like white privilege, are typically actually used, which is, so in this case, if we go by what Martin actually thought was happening, a white man is debating a black woman, and he argues, well, you should get the job based on what kind of merit you have. Do you have this experience? Do you have that experience? And some experience might not translate well into other jobs. His example was covering sports might not translate well into covering politics. But it's easy to come up with even better examples of that. My education and training in philosophy probably wouldn't translate very well into me, say, being a nuclear engineer for a nuclear power plant. There's just not a good connection there. So if I applied for a job as a nuclear engineer based on my credentials, I shouldn't get it. And so that's what they were debating. And rather than her just arguing against his point, trying to say, well, no, you're wrong, and here's why, she just said, you only get to say that because you have white privilege. And so, in effect, she tried to use it as a conversation stopper. And that's what's so wrong about this, that it warrants my facepalm and sigh award. When somebody makes an appeal like that, what they're telling you is, I can't argue with your point, so I'm just going to start throwing ad hominem attacks at you, because that's what that essentially is you only can argue from a position of privilege. If you were really in my position, you wouldn't be able to make that argument. Which is really what someone is saying when they accuse someone of something like white privilege or very similar concepts. Now, of course, that's not to say that privileges don't exist. I mean, compare my life where I get to do podcasts and talk about philosophy that I like to say the life of somebody in, I don't know, India who lives on $1 a day. Well, I'm immensely privileged when compared to them. But when you start considering things a little bit more broadly, as Webb was trying to allude to with his quote there, you're going to immediately realize that everybody is more privileged than everybody else, and in some cases everybody else is less privileged than everybody else. Just for example, I grew up in a town in Montana called Boulder, which probably only had about 2,000 or 3,000 people and was, generally speaking, pretty poor. And I would be surprised if more than 2 or 3 black people lived in that whole town. But if the white people who did live in that town, if you told them they have a bunch of white privilege, they'd look at you like they were crazy, because it wasn't really a good place to live, and they didn't really have any privilege where they were at, certainly not by virtue of being white anyway. And so what that illustrates is, privilege is a far more complicated situation than just, what color are you? There's who your parents were, how your parents reacted, what socioeconomic status are you from, what country were you from, and on and on and on and on it goes. And then on top of that, some things that people will say are your privilege really aren't privilege in the sense that it's something you didn't have anything to do with. The whole idea that makes privilege unfair is if you're born in a situation and you get things from it that you didn't acquire by your own merit. So easy example I guess I like to pick on him a little bit is President Trump was born to a wealthy family. So it was more likely he was going to wind up being a pretty wealthy guy, much more likely than me, who was not born to a very wealthy family. So that was his privilege, and he could have squandered it or taken advantage of it. In his case, he took advantage of it and wound up being a pretty wealthy guy. So that's a privilege that was, in many senses, unearned because he was born into it. At the same time, you can turn around and say, well, but he's done some things where he's made money on his own, he's been successful in this and this there, maybe not so much there, but you can point to some successes, and then where he's getting things from his own successes, his own choices, you wouldn't then be able to say that's his privilege, because he did it himself. It was due to choices he made and actions he took. And there are many less contentious examples of this. Everything about President Trump is contentious, but suppose you go out and get a very well-paying, like six-figure-a-year job, and you get that job because you went to a university, got a good undergraduate degree, got into a good graduate school, graduate from the graduate school, and get right in and start making good money. Well, that's no longer your privilege. It's not something that's unearned from you. You earned it by virtue of what you did, going to school and working hard, and so on and so forth. Now, some people will turn around and argue that this is all muddled because maybe you only got to go to school because of certain privileges you were born with, and sometimes that is true. But what I hope you're seeing as I'm starting to run through this and explain it all a bit is all this whole concept of privilege, who's got it and who doesn't, is immensely more complicated than you can fairly address by just saying to somebody, you only get to say that because you have white privilege. That's ridiculous. It downplays so many factors. Some people certainly are more privileged than others, and sometimes that's due to various merits they have, good decisions they've made, how hard they've worked. Sometimes it's not. Very often it's a combination of many things because life is complicated. It's almost always a combination of many things. So to just throw out, oh, you only get to say that because of your privilege, is just a stupid conversation stopper, and it actually tells me that you're not willing to argue and have a good, reasonable, rational discussion because you're throwing out conversation stoppers rather than trying to address what's going on. And that's why I'm giving Arvia, and again, I'm sure I'm mispronouncing her name, I'm just really bad about that. That's why I'm giving her, the Arvia Martin, the Facepalm and Sigh Award of the Week, because not only did she badly bundle this whole white privilege thing, but she was trying to use it to just shut down conversation instead of actually have it. So that's why I give it to her. Moving on. So the topic this week is based on an essay I presented, I want to say a little less than a year ago at a conference, and I called this essay, The Failed War on Poverty, Why the Government Cannot and Should Not Address Poverty. So I'll just dive right into it. I've got some comments I'll make on the front of it and the end of it, and I'll do a little more than just read the essay, and hopefully you'll learn a few things and be able to tell me whether you think I'm right or wrong or what's going on there. This is an essay I presented at the 47th meeting of the Society for Pentecostal Studies. You'll actually get a more complete version of it here because I haven't had to edit it down for time. Now, I'll make two comments here before I get to the essay. The first is that I wrote this with a specifically Christian audience in mind, but I do think non-Christians can and should be moved by the arguments as well, as I don't think there's anything specifically Christian about them. So, if you weren't a Christian but are interested in this topic, then I just ask that you bear with me through some of the terminology and phrases I'll use, as I hope you'll see that these arguments can work absent Christianity, or at least I think they can. Second, after my presentation at SPS, a gentleman there asked me what all this has to do with philosophy, and this is not a topic you typically hear philosophers talk about. But it seems to me that one of the great values of philosophy is that it can do sort of meta-analysis of other disciplines and ask questions and point to issues that those other disciplines are unable to address or unwilling to ask. And that's what I'm trying to do here. I think part of the reason why much of academic philosophy is not valued by the general public is that most philosophers don't even bother with such things anymore, and they often disdainfully label such things as practical philosophy, as though it's somehow less philosophical to ask important questions about life and how we actually do things. That's one of the reasons why I like doing philosophy as religion, as we still do practical philosophy, as if it actually has value, and that seems to be rare in other philosophical disciplines. But enough of that. Now, there's a lot of references and citations in this essay, which obviously you're not going to get listening to it on a podcast like this. So if you're very interested, email me in, contact me on Facebook, and I'll send you the references. And also, I have put a version of this up on YouTube where you can find some of the references if you want to go look there as well, just because a lot of this information is contentious, and if you feel the need to go check it out, I'll make it easy for you to do that. An awful lot of ink has been spent discussing and arguing about entitlement, public aid, and welfare programs and the various types of governments and economic systems that run these programs. For example, there's a distinction between welfare state capitalism and liberal socialism. Conversely, others distinguish between up to 5 types of welfare states. The majority of these discussions seem to remain in the theoretical and abstract as various models and ideas are evaluated and accepted or rejected. So one of the goals of this essay is to push this discussion back toward the practical realm. And I think this is possible because the U.S. government has supplied us with an awful lot of real-world data, as it has been spending a great deal of money on many different social programs over the past 50 years or so. In 1964, President Lyndon Johnson started the War on Poverty. To illustrate the need for the war, and for good PR, Johnson went to Inez, Kentucky, and stopped on Tom Fletcher's porch. At the time, the citizens of Inez were poor. Many of them were unemployed, and their children were malnourished. Fletcher was 38, could not read, had not finished elementary school, had a wife and 8 children, and thanks to the closure of the mines and sawmills, was unemployed. Johnson used Fletcher's struggles as a springboard for his own announcement. "I have called for a national war on poverty," he declared. "Our objective, total victory." Unfortunately, the data of the last 50 years shows that Johnson and America did not achieve total victory. In fact, this data argues that the U.S. government is pretty bad at addressing and eliminating poverty. Some people have gone as far to say that poverty won, although that's a bit of an overstatement. Now, for the sake of space and ease, this essay simply assumes 2 things. First, that Christians have a specific moral and ethical responsibility to the poor, oppressed, and other less fortunate members of society. Well, arguments can be made that all people have such a general responsibility to the less fortunate. Christ and the New Testament authors clearly and unequivocally lay such a responsibility on Christians. So for the sake of space, rather than spending time arguing for this responsibility, it will be just assumed here. And if you doubt that, I suggest you just go read the Bible. Second, the arguments made here are intended only to apply within the context of the United States. While it's possible that some arguments, principles, and ideas at work here might apply in other countries and contexts, the focus here is specifically on the U.S. What works in the U.S. may or may not work in other countries and vice versa. Now, as historically Christianity has always accepted that there is a good and legitimate role for the state, then, broadly speaking, there are 3 possible approaches to meeting this responsibility to the poor. It can be done entirely through the state and its institutions. It can be done entirely absent the state through things like private organizations, personal charity, and religious institutions. Or we can have a combination of the 2. From now on, I will refer to these as the state, non-state, and mixed options. And even within these options, there are a wide variety of possibilities. Giving my friend money to help him meet his rent and donating to a large private international charity like the Red Cross are quite different, but both will fall under the non-state option. Likewise, having the state run programs like Social Security and welfare is vastly different than a state that seizes and redistributes all assets and property, like North Korea, but both of these fall under the state approach. Now, currently in the U.S., there is a very messy mixed approach that leans heavily in the direction of the state. It is messy in the sense that there is often overlap and redundancy between the non-state actors and the state, and it leans in the direction of the state as the state spends and distributes far more money in this area than any non-state actors do. So, I'm seeking to defend 3 main claims. 1, the U.S. government spends far more money on public aid programs than it does on anything else. Around 2/3 of the U.S. government spending is on public aid programs, and since the 1960s, around $20 trillion has been spent on such programs. 2, the poverty rate has remained more or less stagnant. In 1966, the poverty rate was at 14.7%. In 2016, it was at 12.7%. And 3, and I think most importantly, using the government to address these issues dehumanizes people. Now, public perception on these issues seems to be quite skewed, as most people simply do not understand how much money the government has actually spent on these programs. Since the 1960s, the U.S. government has spent about $20 trillion in anti-poverty, social, and entitlement programs, i.e., public aid. And yet the poverty rate in the U.S. has remained more or less stagnant. Further, such social programs are now responsible for the vast majority of government spending, and these programs significantly exceed the expenses of the most expensive military in recorded history. Now, the U.S. does spend a great deal of money on defense. In 2016, we spent $585 billion on defense, more than the military budgets of China, Russia, Saudi Arabia, France, Britain, and India combined. This number does not even include many other defense and military-related items like veterans benefits and the Department of Homeland Security. These additional things cost about another $300 billion, which brings the total amount the U.S. spent on military, defense, and related items to about $885 billion for 2016. And yet the U.S. spent almost 3 times this much on public aid programs. In fiscal year 2016, $2.47 trillion of the federal government's $3.66 trillion in non-interest expenses came from the mandatory spending categories of Social Security, Medicare, and Medicaid. Now, this figure doesn't even include many other programs that are designed as social and anti-poverty measures, such as the Supplemental Nutrition Assistance Program, i.e. food stamps, and subsidized housing, government housing, which fall under the Departments of Agriculture and Housing, respectively. Nonetheless, public perception is that the U.S. spends most of its resources on defense, and Roger Ray expresses this idea. He says, "From my own observation of the way our economy has been run, the way banks, corporations, and sadly enough, even our own government basically make decisions, it looks like the objectivism of Rand's school of self-gratification is being lived out against the alternative view that I would call a spiritual worldview based on global perspective on ethics." And there he's referring to Ayn Rand's objectivism, virtue of selfishness. Look it up if you want to. But this simply cannot be true, as the government spends about 2/3 of its budget on public aid programs. In 2016, $885 billion went to defense, $2.47 trillion was spent in public aid programs, out of $3.66 trillion total. Now, if we break this down as a percent of total spending, in 2016, the government spent 29% on healthcare, 25% on pensions, i.e. Social Security and such, 21% on defense, 9% to federal welfare, 3% to education, and 15% on everything else, transportation, housing, science, international affairs, and so on. So, if we leave out education, as at least some of the education budget does not go to anti-poverty programs, and allow for the anti-poverty programs in the everything else category, i.e. the food stamps and government housing, we arrive at an estimate of approximately 63% to 66% of government spending being taken up by public aid. So, Ray is quite clearly wrong. The U.S.'s priorities in spending are with public aid. Now, I want to note that there's a reasonable amount of variability in the data at work here. Discussions of things like welfare, entitlements, and other such social programs are often sidetracked and hijacked by detailed objections over what the actual amount of money involved is or what the real rate of poverty, unemployment, and so on are. Now, for example, it's possible to make reasonable arguments that the actual amount of money the U.S. spent on public aid is $18 trillion instead of $20 trillion, as some programs, like grants for education, may not provide much direct benefit to the poor and needy. Or I've heard other people claim it's actually as high as $22 trillion. Conversely, someone might argue that the actual spending on entitlements and social programs in 2016 was, say, 60%, as opposed to my estimate of roughly 66%. Or somebody else might argue that Social Security should not be included in this discussion because people pay taxes into Social Security and then receive benefits later on, so it's not exactly the same thing as the government just handing out money. Now, on one level, these are good discussions to have, as the more accurate the data is, the better our conclusions will be. But it's also unreasonable, and I'd think foolish, to demand we get perfect data from a system as large and as complex as the U.S. economy and government spending. So I'll grant that most of the data points I've arrived at here are not absolutely precise, but they're simply good estimates. Now, some wiser and more knowledgeable people than I have may be able to provide some better and even more precise estimates, but that's not going to have any effect on the validity of my arguments below. Whether the amount is 18 trillion or 20 trillion, 60% or 66%, it's still an unimaginably large amount of money. So, the U.S. government has and is spending a lot of resources on social safety nets and other such entitlement programs that are designed to help the orphans and widows, and many other people, in their distress. It's quite likely that the U.S. is spending more money on public aid than any other nation in recorded history. If our priorities are indeed shown by where we spend our money and resources, then the U.S. of the last 50 years or so has been more concerned with orphans and widows than any other country in recorded history. And yet, all these resources and money seem to have accomplished very little. In 1966, when the War on Poverty programs were finally up and running, in the national poverty rate, it stood at 14.7%. By 2014, it stood at 14.8%. In other words, the United States had spent trillions of dollars and seen no reduction in the poverty rate. Now, by 2016, the poverty rate had fallen a bit to 12.7%. The war on poverty is generally regarded to have started in 1964, and while there was an initial decline in the poverty rate, this decline quickly leveled off and then the rate rose again. Generally speaking, it seems that changes to economic policy don't usually have an immediate effect. They often take several years before the consequences, for good or ill, are seen. So as the poverty rate had been declining prior to 1964, it is likely that the continued decline after 1964 was simply a continuation of that trend and probably didn't have much to do with the start of the war on poverty. It's also worth noting here that conservatives like to date the war on poverty from 1966 and liberals like to date it from 1964 because there was that initial drop, and people in favor of these programs like to point to that, and people who aren't try to find some way to avoid that. Now, it's not fair to say that all this accomplished nothing. Very little is not the same thing as nothing. It's not fair or accurate to claim that there has been absolutely no return on the $20 trillion spent. It's still far better to be poor in the U.S. than it is to be anywhere else in the world, excepting maybe a few countries in Europe. As Arthur C. Brooks says, "The welfare state and modern technology have made joblessness and poverty less materially painful. Economic growth and innovation have delivered material abundance. Some of the War on Poverty's programs have proved effective at bolstering struggling families. But even though poverty has become less materially miserable, it is no less common." The economist David J. Deming agrees, saying, "You're much better off being poor in 2013 than poor in 1913. I think the gaps are widening, but the absolute level of human welfare is also rising across the board." And almost certainly the massive amount of money spent on public aid in the war on poverty has to at least be partially responsible for this decline in the misery of being poor. Even conservatives have found some things to praise in all these expenditures. As Patrick M. Gary argues, "Welfare programs that incentivize work have been far more successful in boosting incomes and mobility than simple cash assistance programs. The U.S. Census Bureau estimates that the Earned Income Tax Credit lifted 5.4 million people out of poverty in 2010 alone." Conservatives advocate expanding this EITC to childless adults, reducing the marriage penalty by adding a second earner deduction, and reducing the disincentives to work in other welfare programs. So, it's not true to argue that the war on poverty has accomplished nothing, but the relatively stagnant poverty rate argues that it has accomplished very little. By comparison, the U.S. has directly spent only an estimated $9.3 trillion in every single major war in the nation's history. The total cost of all major U.S. wars up to August 2016, which was the best data that was available when I was writing this essay, that's approximately $9.3 trillion. This number is adjusted for inflation. Now, I arrived at this number by combining the data in two sources. There's a congressional report by Stephen Daggert that lists the cost of all U.S. wars up to 2010 and then adjusts for inflation. And up through 2001, this cost is $5.714 trillion. Then in a research paper called U.S. Budgetary Costs of Wars through 2016, Nedesi Crawford argues that the total cost of U.S. wars from 2001 to August 2016 was $4.79 trillion. However, she also included veterans' benefits in this number. As Daggert did not include the veterans' benefits due to the obvious limitations that you just can't get that information from, say, the Civil War and the Revolutionary War, I used Crawford's number minus the benefits that she listed for veterans, and that's approximately $3.6 trillion. Then just add them together, and you wind up with about $9.3 trillion. Thus, by any reasonable measure, this means an awful lot of money has been wasted. Had the government simply held on to that $20 trillion, put it aside, and not used it, it could now end all poverty in the U.S. by simply giving the money away. Here's a thought experiment to demonstrate this. In 2016, the government estimated 40.6 million people were in poverty. The average threshold of poverty for that same year was $12,228 for a single person. So, by its own definitions, all the U.S. government would have had to do to eliminate poverty in 2016 is give everyone in poverty at least $12,229. That would have only cost $496.4 billion. Now, but this would have only been for about a year, so let's be a little more generous and assume the government wants to eliminate poverty for the next 20 years, and instead of $12,229, it sends everyone an even $20,000. That would cost $16.2 trillion. Now, there are some obvious limitations to this thought experiment. It doesn't account for changing variables such as the poverty rate fluctuating, inflation, changes in the cost of living, and so on. Further, in this experiment, if a household in poverty has 6 people, that household would receive $120,000, and this is quite obviously much more than they need to just rise out of poverty. But what it does demonstrate to us is that the war on poverty did not fail due to a lack of resources and money. Right now, the poverty-stricken in America would be better off if, rather than starting these public aid programs, President Johnson had simply created a very large trust fund for future distribution. Statistically speaking, we're now at the point where if the government had literally started throwing money at people, it would do more good. Now, I'm sure the initial skeptical reaction to my thought experiment will probably be that things really just aren't that simple. You can't just give money to people and to get them out of poverty. And well, in a certain sense that's true, in another sense it's not. Things are a bit more complicated than that. For the most part, the government cannot bring people out of poverty, and that's what the above data demonstrates. But it does seem that individuals can and often do help others rise out of poverty. Now, the obvious question here is why? Why is the U.S. government unable to make a significant dent in poverty? Well, using the data of the last 50 years, Lowell E. Galloway and Daniel G. Garrett argue that public aid in the U.S. has a Laffer curve relationship with poverty, which is to say that while public aid initially decreases poverty, there eventually comes a point at which additional increases in public aid increase poverty. The effectiveness of additional real public aid expenditures as a policy instrument designed to reduce the poverty rate had been exhausted by the mid-1970s. Indeed, any additional public aid beyond the mid-1970s levels would have resulted in an increase, not a decrease, in the poverty rate. They go on to explain in detail. The greatest poverty-reducing effect occurs at $1,291 of per capita expenditure on public aid, which produces a 6.07 percentage point reduction in the overall poverty rate. However, as the level of real per capita public aid rises beyond $1,291, the poverty-reducing effect is eroded. At the $1,500 per capita level, the reduction in poverty falls to 5.81 percentage points. At $2,000 per capita, the poverty rate decline is only 3.74 percentage points. At $2,407 of per capita public aid, all the initial reductions in the poverty rate have disappeared. And you can see as the trend continues, eventually it actually starts increasing the poverty rate as the spending continues to increase. Now, this is easily explained on the micro as well as the macro level. If I give a friend, let's call him Calvin, $100 to help pay his rent, I've helped prevent him from becoming homeless. Now, being homeless will make Calvin's life much, much harder. It'll probably be harder for him to maintain a steady job. Without a steady address, it'll be more difficult for him to engage in many commercial and financial activities, and so on. So, in this sense, the initial $100 provides more benefit to Calvin than just the value of the money. It enables him to keep his options open and grants him more opportunities. But if I give Calvin an additional $100, that doesn't help him keep those same opportunities. It doesn't provide the same extra value that the initial amount did. The additional $100 is not helping him keep those opportunities he has by not being homeless, because he has the first $100 for that. Now, of course, depending on Calvin's context, that extra $100 may grant him some other opportunities, but probably not to the same degree the initial $100 did. As I keep increasing the amount of money I give Calvin, we find that the practical value of the money actually keeps decreasing. Eventually, it reaches a point where extra money doesn't really do any good at all, as it doesn't enable new opportunities, other than, dancing and celebrating for having more money. The point is, when you're down at $0, it's very, very hard to get anything. but it's not near as hard to go to $200 from $100, or to $2,000 from $1,000, and so on and so forth. Now, let's suppose Calvin is a pretty rational guy who generally does what is easiest. Most people actually tend to do what they perceive to be the easiest thing. If Calvin is also an American, he will probably have an idea of individualism which leads him to think of his personal self-interest over and above what is in his community's interest, his nation's interest, and so on. So if I keep giving Calvin $100 every month, it's going to make it easier for him to stop looking for other ways to get the funds he needs. It's a lot easier to take my aid, and, all other things being equal, rational people are going to tend to do what is easier. As Brian Griffiths explains, if food is brought in, why produce it? If bureaucracy can profit from handing out aid, why engage in domestic production? If personal wealth can be obtained through holding political office, why bother to set up a new enterprise? If agricultural output must be sold to a government monopoly buying agency, why bother to innovate and seek out new markets? And if Calvin can depend on my aid to meet his rent, why seek out other sources of income? Now, of course, there are other reasons that Calvin should do this, like moral reasons, but this illustrates the fundamental problem that Galloway and Garrett above were pointing to. The longer I give Calvin money and the more money I give him, the more and more he will come to depend on that money. Beyond a certain threshold, my aid will start disincentivizing Calvin from pursuing other opportunities. This principle is what Charles Murray called the law of unintended rewards. Any social transfer increases the net value of being in the condition that prompted that transfer. While the initial gift helped him a great deal, there are diminishing returns on subsequent gifts as they actually help him less and less until at some point they will actually start to hurt by making it easier for Calvin to take the less virtuous and less independent path. Now, where these thresholds are is going to vary greatly from person to person depending on the context they're in. Some people genuinely need a lot more help than others. This is an unintended consequence of public aid and is one of the main problems that most sides of the debate seem to miss. No one wanted to make people dependent on the government, and no one wanted to hurt people by increasing the net value of remaining in poverty. This is exactly the opposite of what everyone wanted, but this is what happened. Political conservatives often ignore that the initial aid usually helps people a great deal, whereas political liberals usually ignore that at some point the aid stops helping and starts hurting. And while reasonable people can disagree about exactly where this threshold is, at $20 trillion spent and 2/3 of the government expenditures sent to public aid, it's painfully obvious we passed it a long, long time ago. So this is the number one problem with the state option. Now, the U.S. government has proven itself to be very inept at avoiding unintended consequences. Here's a funny example I saw a few weeks ago where a dog got unemployment. And when you dig into the story, it has a few things to do with identity theft and whatnot, but the fact of the matter is the government really did send a dog an unemployment check. As a more serious example, while he admits that the causes of declining birth rates in the U.S. are numerous and varied, the author Jonathan V. Last argues that establishing entitlement programs is one of the causes. There are two large consequences of establishing government-funded programs for care of the elderly. The first was that children were no longer needed to look after their retired parents. Where people's offspring had for centuries seen to the financial needs of their parents, retired people with no offspring now had access to a set of comparable benefits. They could free-ride the system. This new system undermined the ancient rationale for childbearing. In a world in which childbearing has no practical benefit, the government will care for you if you don't have children to do so, then parenthood becomes a simple act of consumption. People have babies because they want to, because the most insidious effect of the Social Security and Medicare regimes is they actually shift economic incentives away from having children. Remember, you and I don't pay for our Social Security benefits. We pay for the generation ahead of us, and our benefits come from the taxes paid by the generation of workers behind us. Social Security and Medicaid are no longer stopgaps to protect elderly pensioners on the verge of poverty. These programs are now incentivizing couples to have fewer or no children. Now, this is a pretty extreme unintended consequence, as it means that in a Hegelian sense, Social Security and Medicare contain the seeds of their own destruction. These programs depend on an ever-increasing population, and yet incentivize smaller families, and thus encourage a smaller population. Another unintended consequence of public aid programs is that they inadvertently promote single-parent families. It is no accident that the collapse of marriage in America largely began with the war on poverty and the proliferation of means-tested welfare programs that it fostered. When the war on poverty began, only a single welfare program assisted single parents. Today, dozens of programs provide benefits to families with children. Although married couples with children can also receive aid through these programs, the overwhelming majority of assistance to families with children goes to the single-parent households. Means-tested welfare programs financially enable single parenthood. It is difficult for single mothers with a high school degree or less to support children without the aid of another parent. Means-tested welfare programs substantially reduce this difficulty by providing extensive support to single parents. Welfare thereby reduces the financial need for marriage. Since the beginning of the war on poverty, less educated mothers have increasingly become married to the welfare state and to the U.S. taxpayer rather than to the fathers of their children. And means-tested welfare programs also inadvertently penalize marriage. Since means-tested means that as a family's income increases, their benefits will decrease, then a mother can maximize welfare by remaining unmarried and keeping the father's income off the books. For example, a single mother with 2 children who earns $15,000 per year will generally receive around $5,200 per year of food stamp benefits. However, if she marries a father with the same earnings level, her food stamps would be cut to zero. So the practical effect is that public aid has made marriage a less attractive option for people receiving public aid. Now, the federal government operates over 80 means-tested welfare programs that provide cash, food, housing, medical care, and social services to poor and low-income individuals. Each program contains marriage penalties. Since low-income families generally receive benefits from several programs at the same time, then the marriage penalties from multiple programs added together can provide substantial financial disincentives to marriage. For example, if a single mother who earns $20,000 per year marries a man who earns the same amount, the couple can typically lose about $12,000 a year in welfare benefits. So the welfare system makes it economically irrational for most low-income couples to marry. Now, of course, the intent behind means-tested programs was not to encourage single mothers to avoid marrying the fathers of their children. Rather, for the most part, it was to look after orphans and widows in their distress. But this unintended consequence has the disastrous result of propounding the problem the public aid programs seek to fix. There are countless studies pointing to the fact that children raised in a 2-parent home do better in life and are far more likely to live above the poverty line. Hence, the means-tested welfare programs encourage single-parent homes and thus increase the likelihood of the future need for these very same programs. Unlike Social Security and Medicare, these programs seem to self-perpetuate their own existence. The law of unintended consequences states that you cannot always predict the results of purposeful action. Life is frequently too complicated and unpredictable. The universe is too random to bend to the will of any individual or group of individuals. Now, unintended consequences and government programs go hand in hand for 2 reasons. The first is that government bureaucracy is very large and complex, and the second is that it is almost never in anyone's self-interest to end a public aid program, despite what that program is or is not accomplishing. Now, a simple principle is that the larger and more complex a system, program, or idea is, the more likely it is that it will have unintended consequences. The more moving parts something has, the more chances it has to break. So, if I observe that Calvin has stopped looking for a job thanks to me giving him aid, I can easily just stop giving him that aid, give him the aid on the condition he keeps looking for work, talk to him about the problem, or do many similar things. If I was giving aid to 5 people, this gets harder for me to do, but I could probably still manage. But I couldn't avoid unintended consequences if I was regularly giving aid to 500 people. And there is simply no way to avoid severe unintended consequences when giving $2.47 trillion to over 100 million people. Only God could figure out how to avoid unintended consequences in a system that big and complex. This is a major reason why the U.S. government has proved so ineffective at fighting poverty. At first, public aid programs did seem to be helping people, and then it all seemed to spin out of control as the various systems got too big and complicated, and the law of unintended consequences took over. Further, the way these programs are organized makes it nearly impossible to avoid unintended consequences. If Calvin is getting aid from the government, and his senator says that Calvin's aid program needs to be modified or canceled, Calvin will be much less likely to vote for his senator. So, it is actually in the senator's self-interest not to mess with the aid programs, regardless of whether or not they're working. And thus, in the U.S., virtually the entire legislative branch says that something must be done about the rising cost of public aid, but virtually all of them refuse to do anything. There is an odd dynamic at work here where what's best for the group is not what's best for the individual and vice versa. So, those who look at the numbers know what's coming. An entitlement tsunami brought about by the escalating costs of Medicare and Medicaid. This is one of the most significant challenges we face as a nation, yet there is almost no serious public discourse on the issue. Entitlements are the third rail of American politics. Touch them and you die, and hence, no one in the government wants to touch them. Now, of course, in theory, Congress could pass bills and laws tomorrow that would end mandatory entitlement programs like Social Security and Medicare. But they are not going to do that because it runs contrary to their self-interest to do so. I mean, in theory, I could go walk off a 12-story building tomorrow, but you're pretty much guaranteed I'm not going to do that because it runs contrary to my self-interest. This dynamic frequently causes Congress to pass bills that it does not fully understand, that cannot be enforced with any precision, and that are full of loopholes begging for court challenges and conflicting interpretations. Stephen M. Gillen argues that Johnson and his fellow poverty warriors started the war on poverty in much the same way. They ignored most of the evidence of the prior 30 years that FDR's New Deal had given them. Thus, the war on poverty was the poster child of unintended consequences. Not only was it plagued by faulty assumptions and false expectations, but it also fell victim to the imperious immediacy of interest. Since President Johnson was so determined to surpass his idol, Franklin Roosevelt, and to distinguish himself from his slain predecessor, John F. Kennedy, passing legislation became a goal in itself. As the history of community action reveals, Johnson's administration committed itself to passing a poverty program and only later stumbled on the method for implementing it. The administration then proceeded to push the program through a pliant Congress without defining what it meant by community action. And, of course, all this is without even considering the vast number of bureaucrats and administrators that actually run these programs, because it's certainly not in their self-interest to do anything about it either. They'd lose their jobs. But none of these problems exist if it's just me handing Calvin a $100 bill. Now, the other and most important problem with the state option is that it encourages us to treat people as numbers on a balance sheet and thus dehumanize them. Now, the arguments above have been treating the impoverished as if they're a statistical problem to be solved, i.e., if we can just get the right system, tweak it properly, and fund it properly, then poverty will be solved. And the state option forces us into this type of discussion. If it is going to work with any sense of efficiency, then by necessity, the government will often have to treat people as numbers on a balance sheet. But if I'm going to treat Calvin as Christ would have me treat him, then necessarily I have to treat him as much more than a number on a balance sheet. If I see Calvin as nothing more than an expense I send $100 to every month, then I'm not looking at him as Christ would. When we abdicate our responsibilities to the state, we no longer have to actually interact with any people in poverty. This turns them into faceless and nameless statistical victims. The reason why we have an imperative to look after orphans and widows in their distress and to help the needy is not because there's an arbitrary need to balance economics or because Christ commanded us to try to make sure everyone has the same level of wealth. Rather, it is because the orphan, the widow, and those in poverty bear the image of God just as everyone else does. Or, as J. Philip Wagman summarizes Dietrich Bonhoeffer, we understand why hunger and oppression, disease and war matter. It is not because the material conditions to which they refer are themselves ultimate. It is rather because such conditions impede the life and grace that is intended by God. So the hungry man needs bread, and the homeless man needs a roof. The dispossessed need justice, and the lonely need fellowship. The undisciplined needs order, and the slave needs freedom. For to allow the hungry man to remain hungry would be blasphemy against God and one's neighbor. For what is nearest to God is precisely the need of one's neighbor. When we abdicate this responsibility to the state, we no longer have to interact with people in poverty. We do not need to get to know them for the people they are. We do not have to understand their needs, lives, situations, and contexts. I have absolutely no idea if the person who got their welfare check thanks in part to my taxes can tell a good joke or not. And as far as the U.S. taxpayer is concerned, a person in poverty is little more than a dollar amount their taxes go to. Fulfilling our biblical obligations to those in poverty by paying our taxes simply makes it too easy to view them as other or as only human in the abstract rather than the real sense. If they are seen at all, it is just as statistical victims and not as actual people. But importantly, this isn't just a theological claim. Deborah A. Small, George Lowenstein, and Paul Slovic demonstrated through 4 studies that people do not value the lives of others consistently and rationally. Rather, money is often concentrated on a single victim, even though more people would be helped if resources were dispersed or spent protecting future victims. They further explain, charities struggle to raise money to feed thousands of starving children in third world countries, and advocates struggle to raise public support for highway safety measures that would reduce future accident fatalities. Yet people often become entrenched by specific identifiable victims. When an identifiable victim is made into a cause, people appear to be quite compassionate and generous. However, at other times, people appear self-interested and callous, giving nothing despite the enormity of the need. In this paper, we examine the consequences of attempting to de-bias the effect by educating people about it, by teaching them about the inconsistent sympathy invoked by statistical and identifiable victims. De-biasing the discrepancy in giving is important because concentrating large sums of money on a single victim is inefficient. In many cases, society would be better off if resources were spread among victims such that each additional dollar is spent where it will do the most good. Yet, when making a decision to donate money toward a cause, most people probably do not calculate the expected benefit of their donation. Rather, choices are made intuitively based on spontaneous, affective reactions. The conclusion of their 4 studies was that when people were made aware of their bias in favor of the identifiable victim, their sympathy toward that victim decreased. However, there was no corresponding increase in sympathy for the faceless statistical victims. When the researchers made people think about it, people became less sympathetic to others. These findings support the more general notion that certain stimuli naturally invoke more affect than others, and that cognitive deliberation can undermine outcomes that typically arise when choices are made effectively. In this case, encouraging people to think about their choices had an unfavorable effect on social welfare. While they do not mention this in the article, the obvious explanation of their disturbing findings is the dehumanizing effect. This reduces actual people to statistical victims. You do not see or touch actual people the numbers on a balance sheet represent. Statistical victims are in every meaningful sense remote others that we do not connect with. For example, I did not know anyone who was in any way connected with the Las Vegas mass shooting in 2017. Conversely, one of my cousins and her family lived in Hawaii during the 2018 ballistic missile false alarm there. Now, by every rational and reasonable measure, the Las Vegas mass shooting was a far worse event than the false alarm in Hawaii, and yet I felt more anguish over the false alarm. The obvious reason why, which Small, Lowenstein, and Slavek's research points to, is because I know people involved in the false alarm. I can put a face to it. The one event is more humanized for me than the other is. This is despite the fact that I objectively know the mass shooting is much worse, much more serious, and far more worthy of my attention and anguish. Yet one of these events has a human face for me, and the other does not. This is what the dehumanizing effect does. It removes or weakens the connections we have to actual people and encourages us to just think of them as statistical victims. So while this is the shortest and simplest argument here, I think it's the most important one. Most human beings are simply not made to feel great amounts of love and compassion for thousands or millions of individuals. Very few people have that much emotional capacity and strength. Perhaps a sane or another exceptional individual does, but that's not the case for most of us. We need the emotional and human connection to motivate us to action. And if you're a saint watching this, I say more power to you. Go out and do it. But I'm not, and most people aren't. We need that emotional and human connection. And the state option robs us of this. So, conversely, if you personally know someone who is living in poverty, you are far more likely to feel genuine sympathy for them and actually help them. Charities certainly recognize this, at least implicitly, when they employ a poster child to raise money for a general cause. And when it is not just a face on a poster, but a person you actually know and have interacted with, you are far more likely to feel for them and really attempt to help them. And it's only in this personal connection that the love and grace of Christ can be found and expressed. Not only is this what we want as Christians, but dehumanizing people has never led to anything good and has almost always led to disastrous and evil results in history. We definitely don't want that. So, the U.S. government has spent an astronomically large amount of money on public aid programs and has seen little substantial return for it. This is significant because it indicates that something is wrong with having the government run public aid programs, and because typical public perception is that the government spends the majority of its resources on other things. The problem is a combination of a government bureaucracy that is too large and complex to avoid massive unintended consequences, and a political system that is unable to address these consequences. The way the U.S. government is structured necessitates that it is simply unable to avoid these problems. So, as Galloway and Garrett demonstrated, when the government was providing a relatively small amount of public aid, this seemed to work pretty well. But when the amount of aid increased, Murray's law of unintended rewards and the law of unintended consequences kicked in, and over time the very programs that were intended to help started causing even more problems. Since then, a great deal of political energy has been spent trying to rework and fix these programs. But these reforms and modifications haven't ultimately worked because they simply cannot avoid Murray's law of unintended rewards and the law of unintended consequences. No government as big and as complicated as the U.S. government can do that. Conversely, providing for orphans, widows, and the impoverished through personal and private charities doesn't seem to suffer from these same problems to the same degree. There will always be some amount of unintended rewards and unintended consequences, no matter what we do and how we do it. But when we keep our institutions, actions, and intentions small and simple, we can often manage or avoid these problems. At the very least, we can do a much better job of it than a giant collection of institutions and programs like the U.S. government. So for this reason, private charity is much more efficient and effective than government public aid. Jeremiah J. Johnson has reported that religious congregations help over 70 million Americans a year, fueled by a staggering $20 billion in donations. Now, $20 billion seems small and hardly staggering next to $2.47 trillion, and yet this $20 billion might do more good than the $2.47 trillion. Rodney Stark has estimated that the total savings to U.S. society from America's religiousness is $2.67 trillion per year. Now, Stark's total includes all aspect of religiousness, not just donations to charity. But still, part of the reason for this massive variance is that personal and private charity is very good at getting aid to where it benefits people the most, and the government has proven that it is very bad at doing this. So, what happened to Tom Fletcher after President Johnson stopped on his porch? Well, the public aid programs attempted to help him. He got welfare benefits and found employment through government make-work incentives, laboring on crews that cleared brush and picked up trash, but he never held down a steady job. In 1969, Fletcher stopped working and depended on disability and other public aid. His first wife died, and he married a woman 4 decades his junior, with whom he had 2 more children. In a cruel final twist, Fletcher's second wife murdered one of those children and tried to kill the other as part of a scam to collect on their burial insurance. In 2004, with his wife still in prison, Fletcher died. While his standard of living did increase, Fletcher never made it out of poverty. Now, of course, there are some lessons and principles we can take from this story, but that's not why I included it. I began and now end with Fletcher's story to illustrate the most serious unintended consequence of the state option, the dehumanizing effect. Including the story of a real person enables people to connect with this issue. Most people who read my essay or see this presentation will soon forget the facts and figures I cited about government spending and such. $2.47 trillion is such a large amount of money that it might as well be one of small Lowenstein and Slovak's statistical victims. But it's pretty likely you will remember Tom Fletcher's sad story. And the reason why is his story adds a humanizing effect. Now there is, so to speak, a face to put on the issue. No longer is the problem of misspent and wasted public aid just figures and balances. There is a name and a story attached to it. And to a lesser extent, I did the same thing above when I related my own emotional experiences in relation to the Las Vegas mass shooting and the false alarm in Hawaii. Now, if small Lowenstein and Slovak's research is correct, and I really think it is, I'm actually undermining this effect by pointing out that I did it. But I think the larger point here is so valuable that I don't mind undermining it. The humanizing effect is what actually motivates most of us to take action and help out other people. And by distancing us from those we help, the state option robs us of this. This is dangerous, as dehumanizing people has never led to anything good, and it's especially of concern for Christians, as we are only able to manifest the love and grace of Christ if we are actually in relationship with other people. You need that relationship to be as Christ to them. When the state steps in between me and the orphans and widows, I am no longer in relationship with them, not in any meaningful sense of relationship anyway. So, if we abdicate our responsibilities to the orphans and widows to the state, then we allow the state to rob us of the chance to minister to them and to be as Christ to them. This is unacceptable, so I argue that at the least we should avoid the state option in favor of the non-state, or at the very least the mixed option. So that's where the actual essay ends. Now, I'm very sure the first question that'll come to a lot of people's minds is, well, what do I think should be done instead? So it seems pretty clear to me that Galloway and Garrett's research demonstrates that public aid worked best when it was at about the mid-1970s level. So I would say we should start scaling government public aid back to about what it was then. Not overnight. You can't just snap your fingers and take it all away from people. That would be pretty disastrous. But start scaling it back over time. And there's different ways you can do that. And, I'd probably be open to most of them. Like, for example, I don't think my daughter, who's 2 years old right now, should ever receive Social Security. She shouldn't pay into it, and she shouldn't get anything out of it. It's clearly not going to work for her, so why should she pay into it? And so there's things you could do like that. And then with the subsequent drop in taxes that should happen with that, and if that's only going to happen if the government actually gets its act together, which is unlikely, but if that happened, then it would be better to have private charity step in and take over. And that would require a lot of people actually stepping up and connecting with the impoverished people around them, even if it's just through churches and things like that. And that doesn't seem to happen very much now, but it would be a whole lot better if it did. So that's my general outlook as to what we should do instead. Scale back to around the 1970s levels of public aid. Don't do it overnight. Have the step down slowly over time, probably over many, many years, and have the private individuals start stepping up as a void there increases. Encourage private individuals and people who have wealth and resources to step in and take care of each other more.
So now, time to tell me what you think. Do you think my arguments work, that the U.S. government has wasted a lot of money on and resources and time on solving poverty when it just was ill-spent? Do you think it's a noble thing that, okay, maybe we've wasted a lot of money, but better we waste it there than elsewhere? So tell me what you think. Do you like my arguments? Do you dislike them? Give me some feedback. You can always reach me at theexaminedlifewithphil@gmail.com, and I've started a Facebook group for the podcast, and you're certainly welcome to leave comments there, and that's The Examined Life with Phil on Facebook. Just do a search for it. And as always, I'm open to comments and suggestions on other shows and topics that you would like me to pursue or look at. Thanks for listening, and I'll talk to you all again next week.
We hope you enjoyed the program and will join us back for another show on WCAT.